We have all experienced that moment when we offer our genuine heart only to have it tossed aside like trash. We burn ourselves out for people who do not deserve it, only to finally realize the cold indifference reflected in their eyes. True growth is not simply about learning how to love another person, but about learning to love yourself first. It means saving your tenderness for those who truly deserve it and keeping your own boundaries firmly in your hands. Right before I took my last breath, my wife leaned in and whispered that the man she had truly loved all these years was actually my older brother. She revealed that the only reason Henry had agreed to donate his kidney to her was because of their secret romance. Having been granted a second chance at life, I made sure to stay as far away from that woman as possible. Instead, I chose to marry the very woman she used to mock for being overly dramatic and provocatively beautiful. Now she is consumed by regret, kneeling on the cold floor and begging for my mercy. I simply looked down at her with a faint smile and spoke in a calm voice. This time around, I have absolutely no intention of giving you my kidney. The moment I opened my eyes again, I realized with a shock that I was back in my sophomore year of college. Before I could even begin to process the chaos in my mind, my phone began to buzz incessantly on the desk. An iMessage from Sarah flashed across the screen. She asked if I could help her set up a movie date with Henry after our classes were finished for the day. I felt a sharp frown tighten across my forehead as I stared at her name. Sarah had been my wife in my previous life, a woman I once believed I shared a deep and unbreakable bond with. It was only as I lay dying that she finally confessed the truth. She admitted that her heart had always belonged to my brother, never to me. I quickly typed back a message telling her that I was busy and that she would have to figure it out herself. I had absolutely no desire to maintain any kind of connection with her ever again. Since the universe had seen fit to grant me a fresh start, I made a silent vow. This time, I was going to live entirely for myself. Once my heart rate finally slowed down, I took a moment to look around the lecture hall. Most of the faces surrounding me were those of strangers, except for Sarah, who was sitting right next to me. I vividly remembered the first day of the semester in my past life when I stepped in to protect her from two guys who would not leave her alone. I even carried her heavy suitcases all the way to her dorm, which was the catalyst for our long relationship. Back then, she appeared to be such a gentle and quiet girl with a very soft personality. During our time in class together, she frequently brought me coffee and saved a seat for me every morning. She used to invite me to the campus library constantly to study by her side. However, Sarah always harbored a deep hatred for Emily, constantly whispering in my ear that Emily was nothing but a fake and provocative attention seeker. She claimed Emily was always putting on an act and warned me to keep my distance. In my previous life, I was so blinded by my feelings for Sarah that I actually followed her advice. I had ignored countless invitations from Emily to go study together at the library. Eventually, she simply stopped reaching out to me altogether. I turned to Emily Bennett and asked if I could take her out to dinner that evening. Thinking back on how poorly I had treated her, I felt a heavy weight of guilt because she had always been so genuinely kind to me. Emily looked startled for a second, her mouth parting in surprise. She asked if I was being serious and wondered why I had suddenly decided to take her out. I gave her a small smile and told her there was no particular reason. I just mentioned that I was in a fantastic mood and felt like celebrating. She agreed immediately, and her entire expression seemed to brighten with joy. I noticed a faint blush beginning to creep across her pale cheeks. That evening, I took Emily to the sushi place right near the campus entrance. In the middle of our meal, she looked up and asked if I had any plans to go to graduate school. In my past life, I had abandoned my dreams of higher education just to stay with Sarah, which became one of my most haunting regrets. This time, I did not hesitate for a second and told her that I intended to apply to New York University. Emily's eyes sparkled with genuine excitement as she told me she wanted to go there as well. She suggested that we should prepare for the entrance exams together and keep each other on track. I told her that sounded like a perfect plan, feeling a surge of real excitement. Right at that moment, the door to the restaurant swung open, and both Sarah Miller and Henry Walker walked inside. Sarah spotted us immediately, and her face twisted into a deep scowl. She marched over to our table with an aggressive stride. In a shrill and accusatory voice, she demanded to know if this was the important business I had mentioned earlier. She looked at Emily with pure venom in her eyes as she interrogated me. When I was in love with Sarah, I used to find every little thing about her absolutely charming. Even her bratty and entitled behavior seemed somewhat adorable to me back then. Now that my feelings for her have completely vanished, her aggressive and overbearing tone only serves to irritate me. I found myself wishing she would just disappear. I asked her why it mattered and pointed out that she was supposed to be going to a movie with Henry anyway. I told her that since I did not care about her schedule, she had no right to question who I chose to have dinner with. I snapped back at her with a coldness that clearly caught her off guard. Sarah stared at me in stunned silence, as if she could not believe I would ever dare to speak to her in such a way. I did not feel like wasting another second on her, so I stood up and reached for Emily's hand. We were finished with our meal anyway, so I led Emily toward the exit. I told my brother that Emily and I were heading back to campus and stepped out into the night air. Henry came rushing out after us a moment later with a look of genuine concern on his face. Henry asked me why I was being so harsh with Sarah and reminded me that I was supposed to be in love with her. He urged me to go back inside and apologize to smooth things over. My brother Robert Walker had always been a gentle soul who constantly tried to play peacemaker for Sarah and me. He was far too used to acting as the family mediator. I looked him in the eye and told him that Sarah had always been in love with him, not me. I added that I had absolutely no romantic feelings left for her anyway. I gently pulled Emily closer to me and told him that she was the one I was interested in now. I made it clear that I was officially done with Sarah for good. Before Henry could respond, Sarah came storming out of the restaurant with her chin held high in the air. She glared at me as if she were a queen waiting for a lowly subject to beg for her forgiveness. I ignored her entirely and continued walking Emily back toward the university. Emily remained unusually quiet as we walked, keeping her head down the entire time. Feeling a bit uneasy about the silence, I apologized to Emily for using her as an excuse to get away from Sarah. I told her that I knew it was wrong to put her in that position. Her voice was barely a whisper as she asked me if it was really true that I no longer had feelings for Sarah. She seemed to be searching for some kind of reassurance in my answer. I gave her a firm nod and confirmed that I was telling the truth. I promised myself that I would never love that woman again and that I wanted to keep her as far away from my life as possible. After I said that, she seemed to find a sudden burst of courage and looked me directly in the eyes. Her face turned a deep shade of crimson as she asked if it would be okay for her to have feelings for me. I was momentarily stunned as I looked down at Emily's face. I realized then that she was truly beautiful in such a delicate and understated way. She was petite and had such a gentle aura about her that it made me feel an immediate need to protect her. I began to wonder if she had actually been in love with me this whole time. I felt a pang of sadness, wondering if she had suffered in silence back in my previous life when I started pushing her away. I reached out and gently stroked her hair to comfort her. I told her that of course she could, and that it was a genuine honor to be liked by such a wonderful person. I took a breath and told her that I still needed a little bit of time to sort through all the chaos in my mind. I asked her if she would be willing to wait for me until I was ready. She nodded her head vigorously and then looked back down at her feet in embarrassment. I thought to myself that she was being far too adorable in that moment. I was quite surprised when Sarah Miller showed up to find me only a week later. The look on her face was entirely different from her usual arrogance, as she seemed consumed by panic and anxiety. She grabbed my arm and practically dragged me out of the lecture hall. She told me that she needed to speak with me immediately. Every student in the room was staring at us as we left, so I reluctantly followed her out into the hallway. I asked her in a flat voice what she wanted from me. She began to stammer and struggled to find the right words to say. It felt as though she was having a hard time getting whatever it was out into the open. I told her that if it was not anything urgent, I was going back to class. I also made it clear that it was highly inappropriate for her to keep showing up at my classroom like this. Sarah called out my name and stopped me in my tracks. She finally blurted out the question and asked if I wanted to be in a relationship with her. I stood there for a moment in complete disbelief, wondering if I had actually heard her correctly. While I was still trying to process the question, she repeated it again with more confidence. She told me that since I had always been in love with her, we should just start dating. I honestly had no idea what was going on inside her head at that moment. I admitted that I used to have feelings for her, but made it very clear that those feelings were dead. I asked her why she was bothering me instead of pursuing my brother like she always wanted to do. I accused her of trying to use me as a tool to get closer to Henry. She tried to deny it and stammered out a weak response. I told her that I would never be in a relationship with her and that she should act as if we had never met. I even requested that she stop greeting me if we ever ran into each other on campus. I turned my back on her and walked straight back into the classroom. Sarah remained standing in the hallway with her head down, lost in her own thoughts. The strangest thing began to happen after that day because I started seeing her everywhere I went. Whether it was the cafeteria or the local grocery store, she was always there, even lingering outside my dormitory at night. Her constant presence was becoming incredibly irritating, and I finally reached my breaking point. I grabbed her arm and pulled her to a secluded corner to have it out once and for all. I told her that enough was enough and reminded her that I did not have feelings for her anymore. I suggested that she should go bother my brother instead of stalking me. Sarah looked at me with an expression filled with suspicion and confusion. She whispered my name and asked if I'd also come back from the future. Her words hit me like a physical blow to the chest, and I wondered if it was possible that she had been reborn as well. Despite the shock coursing through my system, I managed to keep a neutral expression on my face. I told her that I had no idea what she was talking about and ordered her to stay away from me. She seemed to relax slightly when I did not admit to anything. I then informed her that I had just remembered something important and that I was going to stop paying her rent. Shortly after we started our freshman year, Sarah had complained to me that she could not get along with her roommates. She claimed she was being bullied and felt absolutely miserable living in the dorms. Because I felt so sorry for her back then, I had sacrificed a huge chunk of my own money every month to rent her a private studio apartment in the city. My entire monthly allowance was only $3,000, and I was spending more than half of it just to keep a roof over her head. I often ran out of money for food and had to beg my parents for extra funds. Sarah Miller stood there in absolute shock as the news sank in. I knew for a fact that she only received $1,800 a month for living expenses, which was barely enough for food and certainly not enough for rent. She asked me how I could possibly be so cruel to her as her voice reached a high and piercing pitch. I let out a bitter laugh and asked her why I should not be allowed to stop. I reminded her that I only used to pay for her life because I was in love with her back then. I told her that since she never appreciated my help anyway, I was not going to spend a single cent on her now that my feelings were gone. I asked her if she finally understood the situation. Sarah's eyes immediately welled up with tears of anger as she struggled to maintain her composure. She eventually shouted at me that I was going to deeply regret treating her this way. I told her that I would never experience regret again for as long as I lived. In our previous life together, I was the one who handled every single household chore while she did nothing. I was the sole provider who worked hard to support our entire household. However, my health began to rapidly deteriorate because I was living with only one functioning kidney. Throughout my entire time in the hospital, Sarah did not bother to visit me even once. It was only when I was on the brink of death that she finally made an appearance. She stood by my bed and coldly informed me that she had been in love with my brother her entire life. She had every opportunity to take that secret to her grave, but she chose to hurt me instead. She went out of her way to throw the truth in my face right before I died. All those years of total devotion and hard work were instantly transformed into a cruel joke. She ensured that I would not even be able to find peace in my final moments. I realized then that in her heart, she saw me as nothing more than a jailer who had trapped her in a marriage for over a decade. Her hatred for me ran so deep that she could not even allow me to take my final breath with a shred of dignity or calm. The true irony was that in my past life, I gave her everything I had, only to receive her coldest glares and most arrogant commands in return. It was fascinating that in this life, after only a few harsh words from me, she was suddenly displaying a whole range of emotions that I had never seen before. I did not care about her feelings in the slightest anymore. Right then, my phone rang, and I saw that it was Henry calling me. Henry told me that our parents had just called to say that Sarah's father had suffered a major stroke. He mentioned that the man was in the hospital in San Francisco and needed someone to look after him. I immediately recalled that the exact same thing had happened in my previous life. Back then, my brother and I were so worried about upsetting Sarah that we decided to keep the news from her. I had even taken 2 weeks off from my university classes to stay at the hospital and care for Thomas Miller. Just thinking about Sarah's parents made my blood boil with anger. That couple had always treated me like a lowly servant, and no matter how much kindness I showed them, they never once took me seriously. In my past life, I spent a fortune buying them expensive gifts for every holiday. They would always look at my offerings with pure disdain and complain that they were not luxurious or high-class enough for their tastes. I had poured every dollar I earned into Sarah's lifestyle, and since I was not born into a billionaire family, I ended up reaching middle age with absolutely no savings. When I finally collapsed from illness, it was my own elderly parents who had to pay for my medical bills. I took a deep breath and spoke to Henry with very deliberate clarity. I told my brother that if her father was sick, then his wife should be the one to call her. I insisted that it was none of our business and that we should stay out of it. Henry tried to argue with me, but I cut him off immediately. I reminded him once again that I no longer had any feelings for her, that the conversation was over. I was well aware that my brother had always viewed Sarah Miller as a younger sister figure. Because I loved her, he had naturally gone out of his way to look after her as well. Sarah was standing nearby, and her head snapped in my direction when she heard her name mentioned. I looked her in the eye and told her bluntly that her father had suffered a stroke. It took a moment for the news to register, but then her face went pale. Without saying a single word to me, she turned around and went sprinting out of the building. In my previous life, she had not even found out about the stroke until her father had already been discharged from the hospital. She ran a few yards and then suddenly skidded to a halt. She bit her lip nervously and turned back to look at me. She asked if I would go back to her parents' house with her to help deal with the situation. I gave her a flat refusal without a moment's hesitation. A flash of disappointment and confusion crossed her features, but she ultimately kept her mouth shut and walked away. For the next 2 weeks, it was as if Sarah had completely vanished from my life. She only contacted me once to ask for a loan, which I denied immediately. I made sure to call Henry and warn him not to lend her any money either. My brother was baffled by my sudden coldness and could not understand why I was being so ruthless toward her. Since I was his only brother, he eventually agreed to follow my lead. I found that my life became remarkably peaceful during those 2 weeks of her absence. I threw myself back into my studies and managed to get my grades back on track. I also started taking Emily out on real dates, including a fun murder mystery night and several movies. I found myself increasingly drawn to her unique combination of gentleness and hidden strength. When she finally gathered the courage to confess her feelings for the second time, I reached out with a smile and tapped her on the nose. I told her she was being a silly girl because the man is usually the one who is supposed to make the big confession. She just looked up at me with a determined and stubborn expression. I cleared my throat and spoke to her with a mixture of playfulness and absolute sincerity. I asked Emily Bennett if she would do me the honor of being my girlfriend. She shouted her acceptance with a smile that was as bright as the sun. I felt a surge of happiness knowing that my genuine affection was actually valued by someone. It was a beautiful feeling to realize that this lovely girl truly treasured me. I looked at her and whispered a heartfelt thank you. She tilted her head in confusion, as if she did not understand what I was thanking her for. I told her I was thanking her for loving me and promised that I would always treat her with the respect she deserved. About 2 weeks later, Sarah reappeared in my life, looking incredibly worn out and thin. She spotted me outside the girls' dormitory and came running over as fast as she could. She looked exhausted and told me she was sorry, claiming she finally realized how much I had actually done for her in the past. It was obvious that the stress of caring for Thomas Miller had finally taken its toll on her. In my previous life, I had spent weeks caring for her father until he was fully recovered. Back then, a simple thank you from her was enough to make me feel like the luckiest man alive for days. Thinking back on my former self made me feel embarrassed by my own desperation. I looked at her with a cold expression and told her that I had no idea what she was talking about. Just then, Emily Bennett stepped out of the dormitory building with her bag over her shoulder, ready for our date. She looked noticeably tense when she saw me, standing there with Sarah Miller. I gave Emily a warm smile and reached out to take her hand in mine. I handed her a cup of boba tea and led her right past Sarah without even acknowledging her presence. Sarah suddenly screamed my name from behind us and asked if Emily was the reason I was rejecting her. She shouted at the top of her lungs that Emily was nothing more than a fake and a provocateur. Her voice was so loud that people nearby stopped in their tracks to see what the commotion was about. Emily's face turned bright red from a mixture of embarrassment and intense anger. Emily asked her how she could possibly say such cruel things and accused her of slander. Sarah just let out a cold sneer and asked if stealing someone else's husband was not the definition of being a slut. A shocked silence fell over the entire area after her outrageous claim. I let out a furious roar and stepped in front of Emily to shield her from Sarah's gaze. I demanded to know when I had ever been her husband and reminded her that I did not even like her. I asked her what right she had to insult my girlfriend in public like that. Sarah screamed that she could not believe I was yelling at her for the sake of that woman. She burst into tears, covered her face, and went running away in shame. Emily's eyes were brimming with tears, but she was fighting with all her might to keep them from falling. I knew that any girl would be devastated after being humiliated like that in public. I raised my voice so that everyone in the surrounding crowd could hear me clearly. I informed them that the girl who just ran away was merely a neighbor I had grown up with. I stated that I had no romantic history with her whatsoever and mentioned that she was actually in love with my brother. I told them that I had no idea why she was acting so erratically today. I made it clear that I would never tolerate anyone slandering my girlfriend under any circumstances. I gave a slight nod to the crowd as a gesture of apology for the scene. I asked everyone to please refrain from spreading any false rumors about us. I told them that being with Emily was the greatest blessing of my life and that I did not want her to be hurt by idle gossip. A guy who was waiting for his own girlfriend nearby spoke up and told me that he believed my story. He said I did not look like the kind of person who would ever cheat on someone. Emily Bennett gave my hand a gentle tug and kept her eyes firmly fixed on the ground in shy embarrassment. With everyone watching us, I truly believed that the drama was finally over. I was shocked to find out that very night that Sarah Miller had gone to the university's online forum to make a post. She used Emily Bennett's full name and accused her of being a thief who stole her boyfriend. She even went so far as to upload a collection of old photos of us together from when we were kids. However, she had deliberately cropped my brother Henry Walker out of every single picture to make it look like we were a couple. There were pictures of U.S. shopping, watching movies, and even visiting amusement parks together. At first glance, any stranger would assume that we had been dating for years. A mob of drama-hungry students immediately swarmed the thread and started leaving comments. In less than 2 hours, the post had skyrocketed to the top of the forum's front page. The comments section was filled with vitriolic attacks on both Emily and me. People were calling her a fake and accusing us of being a disgusting, trashy couple that deserved each other. Emily called me in a state of total panic, her voice thick with tears as she asked what we were going to do. She tentatively asked if I had ever actually been in a relationship with Sarah in the past. I told her not to be afraid and tried to soothe her with a calm and steady voice. I swore to her that I had never dated Sarah Miller and that I never would in the future. I asked her if she trusted me and told her that if she did, she should let me handle the situation. Emily sniveled over the phone and told me that she trusted me completely. The moment I hung up the phone, my expression turned cold as ice. I thought to myself that I had truly tried to avoid any further drama with Sarah. I had planned to let the past stay in the past since I was given this new life. However, since she insisted on using such disgusting tactics to provoke me, I decided that it was time to fight back. I advised Emily to stay in her dormitory for the next few days to avoid any harassment. Meanwhile, I sat back and silently watched as the post continued to gain more and more traction online. Once the number of replies reached a fever pitch, I began to meticulously take screenshots of every single defamatory comment. I ended up with over a dozen pages of evidence. I then gathered all the original, uncropped versions of the old photos and wrote a detailed post explaining our actual history together. I even included screenshots of all the messages I'd sent her in the past that she had never bothered to reply to. After organizing all the materials, I uploaded my own thread to the university forum. Since Sarah's original post was already trending, my counterpost gained attention almost instantly. People in the comments were shocked by the sudden and dramatic reversal of the story. Users pointed out that there was clearly a third person who had been cropped out of all of Sarah's photos. They noted that it was obvious Sarah had a much closer relationship with the other man in the pictures. People started commenting on how incredibly manipulative and scheming she was for deliberately editing the photos. They criticized her for ignoring my feelings for years and then trying to ruin my new relationship the moment I found happiness. One commenter compared her behavior to a villain in a palace drama, saying she acted like an entitled queen who enjoyed playing with people's emotions. Several students who had previously attacked us began to post public apologies to Emily Bennett for their harsh words. Others reached out to me as well to apologize for jumping to conclusions. The tide of public opinion had completely turned in our favor. Emily called me again and thanked me over and over for clearing her name. I told her to save her thanks for later and sent her all the evidence I had collected. I instructed her to take the screenshots to the police station and file a formal report for defamation. Emily Bennett seemed surprised by my suggestion and asked if it was perhaps too extreme since we were childhood neighbors. I told her with absolute conviction that I would never allow anyone to hurt her like that, and that Sarah Miller needed to face the consequences. She eventually agreed to follow my lead. Only a short while later, several police officers entered the classroom and escorted Sarah Miller out to take her formal statement. When the three of us finally met at the police station, the reality of the situation finally set in for Sarah. She glared at Emily and asked if she was the one who had filed the report. I informed her that I was the one who had reported her to the authorities. I asked her if she really expected to do something so malicious without facing any kind of retaliation. She looked at me in disbelief and whispered that I had changed into a completely different person. The officer interrupted her and addressed her as Ms. Sarah Miller. He informed her that based on the evidence they had gathered, she was being officially charged with defamation. He explained that her actions had caused significant social harm to the victim. He announced that she would be required to pay Emily Bennett $800 in damages, a $500 fine, and serve 3 days in administrative detention. Sarah Miller's face turned ghostly white the moment she heard she was going to jail. She immediately began to beg the officers to reconsider and promised she had learned her lesson. She cried that she was still a student and that having a criminal record would completely ruin her future prospects. The officer patiently explained that if she could reach a settlement with the victim through mediation, they might consider not enforcing the jail time. As soon as the officer finished speaking, Sarah Miller turned to me with eyes filled with desperation. She begged me not to do this to her. I told her with a completely blank expression that since she was the one who had hurt Emily, begging me would do her no good. After a long period of hesitation, she finally turned toward Emily. She apologized to Emily Bennett for her actions and asked for her forgiveness. She even went so far as to promise that would never happen again. Following the plan we had discussed beforehand, Emily refused to accept the mediation offer. Sarah Miller's face immediately twisted with a new surge of anger. She told the officer that she needed to make a phone call. Since it was a reasonable request, the police had no grounds to deny her. A few minutes later, Robert Walker called my phone. I answered it, feeling quite satisfied that everything was going according to plan. I asked my dad what was going on, and he demanded to know why I was at a police station with Sarah Miller. I told my father that he had no idea what she had done and explained how she had been spreading malicious lies about my girlfriend on campus. I told him she accused me of cheating and that the entire university was talking about us, making it impossible for Emily and me to even show our faces. I intentionally exaggerated the severity of the situation. My dad was surprised to hear I had a girlfriend, but asked if the situation was truly as bad as I was describing. I told him that my girlfriend and I were literally afraid to leave our dorm rooms because of the backlash. Robert Walker's voice grew increasingly angry as he listened to my story. He told me to resolve the issue quickly and mentioned that Thomas Miller had also called him to plead for Sarah. He declared that from this moment forward, our two families would never associate with each other again. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. I had known since the beginning of this drama that our family's relationship was eventually going to end. It was not my place as a younger person to cut off the family connection, so I was glad my father had made the decision himself. I finally agreed to proceed with the mediation process. I set the conditions that Sarah Miller must pay Emily Bennett $5,000 in damages and post a public apology on the university forum and all of her personal social media accounts. Sarah Miller looked absolutely livid, but she eventually agreed to the terms of the settlement. As we were leaving the police station, she grabbed my sleeve and asked if we could speak privately for a moment. I whispered a quick word to Emily Bennett before following Sarah Miller to a quiet spot. She told me she knew I was only dating Emily to get back at her. She claimed she was truly hurt this time and promised that if I broke up with Emily immediately, she would finally agree to be my girlfriend. I told her to stop being ridiculous and reminded her that she had always been in love with Henry Walker. I figured if she was reborn, she should be spending her time chasing Henry instead of me. She began to stammer and struggle for a response. She suddenly looked up at me and asked how I could possibly know that she liked Henry Walker. She realized that she had never actually told me that in this lifetime. Sarah Miller narrowed her eyes and took a step toward me. She asked me point blank if I had also been reborn. Before I could even open my mouth, she started talking to herself and became convinced that I had also come back from the future. She said there was no other explanation for why I was acting so differently. Then her face suddenly drained of all color as she came to a horrifying realization. She whispered about the words she had said to me as I was dying. I looked her in the eye and confirmed that I had indeed been reborn long before she did. I let out a cold smirk and told her that I remembered every single word she had said to me on my deathbed with perfect clarity. Sarah Miller staggered backward and almost lost her footing as she tried to stammer out an explanation. She tried to tell me that she did not mean what she had said. I told her that she should stop bothering me because I was never going to pursue her again. I declared that since I had been given a second chance, I was going to find someone who actually loved me. I gave her a long and meaningful look before telling her that if she truly loved Henry Walker, she was free to go after him. I promised not to stand in her way and told her to go ahead with her pursuit. I then turned and walked away without looking back at her as she stood there on the verge of a total breakdown. For a while after that, I did not see her at all and almost began to believe that she had finally disappeared from my life for good. This lasted until June 27th, just as summer break was approaching. I spent the entire day pacing around my classroom in a state of extreme anxiety. I knew that the following day, June 28th, was the date of my brother's fatal car accident in my previous life. I clenched my fists and vowed that I would not allow history to repeat itself. Just after midnight, I arrived at Henry Walker's apartment and knocked on his door. He was working as a professor at a nearby university, just a short drive from my own campus. Henry asked me what I was doing there so late at night. I told him not to ask any questions and insisted that he spend the entire day with me. In my past life, the accident had occurred after he had left the campus grounds. This time, I watched him like a hawk and refused to let him set foot outside the university gates. It was not until 3 o'clock in the afternoon that I finally allowed myself to relax. The time of the original accident had passed, and it seemed like I had successfully prevented the tragedy. Just as I began to let my guard down, a motorized delivery cart came speeding around the corner and headed straight for my brother. There was no time to react, and my mind went completely blank with horror. I wondered for a split second if fate was truly something that could never be altered. I gritted my teeth and threw myself forward with everything I had. I lunged at my brother and managed to push him out of the direct path of the oncoming vehicle. At that exact moment, another person also dove toward us. The three of us ended up in a tangled heap as we crashed onto the hard pavement. As my brother Robert Walker hit the ground, his leg struck a large stone with a sickening thud. He let out a piercing scream of agony and clutched his leg in pain. I rushed to his side, feeling a wave of intense frustration and guilt wash over me. I heard her whisper Henry's name and realized that the third person in the pile was actually Sarah Miller. She looked like she had aged 10 years in a single month and was so incredibly thin that she was almost unrecognizable. I did not have time to deal with her because I had to call for an ambulance immediately. My brother was sweating profusely and his face was deathly pale, which made me feel like an absolute failure. He had insisted on going to his lecture, and I foolishly believed that he would be safe as long as we stayed on campus. I wished I had been more forceful and kept him locked in his apartment all day. The ambulance arrived quickly, and Sarah Miller insisted on coming with us to the hospital. She spent the entire trip clutching on a Robert Walker's sleeve and whispering to herself. She kept repeating that it was impossible and that he could not die because she had not received a transplant from him in this lifetime. The mention of a kidney triggered a vivid memory from my previous life. I remembered Robert Walker calling me 2 weeks after the accident to tell me that Sarah Miller had been diagnosed with end-stage kidney failure. She had desperately needed a transplant, and I had secretly gone to get tested without telling anyone. It turned out that I was a perfect match for her. I had taken it as a sign from fate that I was meant to save her life. In this life, however, I had no intention of ever making that sacrifice again. I began to wonder if her gone appearance was the result of her being on constant dialysis to stay alive. We arrived at the hospital, and I was relieved to see that my brother was still conscious. After a thorough series of tests, the doctors were able to give us a preliminary diagnosis. He had a fractured jaw and several deep abrasions, but none of his injuries were life-threatening. The medical staff quickly hooked him up to N4 with pain medication. He opened his eyes and whispered a weak thank you to me, telling me that I'd saved his life. I told him it was nothing and made up a story about having a dream where he was in a car accident. I explained that was why I'd been so insistent on staying with him all day. I jokingly called it a prophetic dream, trying to lighten the mood. Meanwhile, Sarah Miller sat frozen in her chair, her eyes glued to Henry Walker's medical charts. She asked Robert Walker why he only had 1 kidney and wondered how that was possible since she had not received a transplant from him this time. I was shocked by her words and grabbed my brother's medical file to see for myself. I could not believe it when I saw the report confirming he only had 1 kidney. My brother explained that he had been born with kidneys of different sizes. He said that the smaller one had eventually withered away as he grew up, leaving him with only 1 functioning kidney. He assured us that the remaining kidney worked perfectly fine and did not really affect his daily life. Sarah Miller stared at the two of us with a completely hollow expression as if all the life had been sucked out of her. She slowly sank to the floor and curled into a ball as she began to sob. Her crying quickly escalated into a full-blown hysterical breakdown. I watched her with a cold and detached expression while my brother, who had no idea what was going on, tried to comfort her. He simply thought she was traumatized by the accident. He told her to stop crying and assured her that he was going to be fine since it was only a broken bone. He mistakenly believed that her tears were out of concern for his well-being. He had no idea that I already knew she was in love with him. In my eyes, her breakdown was a clear sign that she had finally realized the truth. She now knew that in our previous life, Morrison Walker was the one who had actually donated my kidney to her. In my past life, the illness I contracted should not have been fatal. However, because I had donated a kidney to Sarah Miller, my body was too weak to fight it off. Since I only had 1 kidney, many common medications were considered too dangerous for me to use. I ultimately lost my life because the doctors were so limited in how they could treat me. I realized that Sarah Miller must have had lingering suspicions for a long time that I was her actual donor. She likely had not confirmed her suspicions because she had seen Henry Walker's medical records after he died in the previous life. She had mistakenly assumed from the very beginning that the kidney had come from him. Listening to her heart-wrenching sobs now did not evoke even a shred of sympathy in me. Regardless of any tragic misunderstandings, the immense pain she had caused me in my past life was very real. If she had cared even a little bit about me, she would have noticed that we were taking the exact same medications for years. In our 15 years of marriage, none of my sacrifices or efforts were enough to ever win her over or warm her cold heart. Even when I was lying on my deathbed, she went out of her way to tell me that she had always been in love with my brother. She was determined to ensure that I died without even a moment of peace. Her sobs grew louder and louder until she suddenly lunged forward and grabbed me in a tight embrace. She sobbed my name and kept repeating that she was sorry and that she had truly never known the truth. Her grip was so tight that I could not immediately break free. I told her in a cold voice that if she were actually sorry, she would stop bothering me and stay out of my life. Henry Walker watched us with total confusion, having no idea what was actually happening. Eventually, the heavy painkillers took effect, and he drifted off into a deep sleep. Sarah Miller choked out a promise that she would find some way to compensate me for everything. She begged me not to leave her and promised to treat me right in this lifetime. She cried out that she simply could not live without me. She told me that after I died in the previous life, she realized that I had become an absolutely essential part of her existence. She realized that without me, there was no one to make her breakfast or prepare fresh fruit in the fridge. She missed having her laundry done and neatly put away in the closet every day. She complained that the trash bags would just sit by the door forever because there was no one to take them out. She buried her face in my chest and gripped my shirt as she continued her pathetic lament. She admitted that she never realized how expensive the mortgage and car payments were, or that cars required maintenance. She did not even know how to pay the utility bills and cried that she could not survive without me doing everything for her. I finally managed to pry her off of me and looked down with disgust at my wrinkled clothes. I told her she was right about being ignorant because she had never bothered to care about me. I pointed out that she had only ever seen me as a fool who would give her money and do all her labor for free. I informed her that my brother needed his rest and ordered her to leave the room. I made it very clear that she was no longer welcome anywhere near us. When she refused to move, I grabbed her arm and physically dragged her out of the hospital room. I then shut the door and locked it behind her. It took a long time before I finally heard the sound of her footsteps fading away down the hallway. I spent the next 2 days staying by Robert Walker's side in the hospital. My parents, Robert and Mary Walker, arrived at the hospital shortly after. The doctors explained that since the fracture was so severe, Henry would need to undergo surgery to ensure a proper recovery. Over the following weeks, my parents and I took turns looking after Henry. Emily Bennett made several visits to the hospital to check on him as well. She never showed up empty-handed, always bringing fresh flowers and delicious homemade soup for my brother. Both my parents and Henry were extremely impressed with her kindness. The contrast between her and Sarah Miller was like night and day. Sarah had always been flashy and bold, with a provocative style that was meant to turn heads. Emily, on the other hand, was a graceful and understated beauty who dressed modestly and always made people feel at ease around her. On the day Robert Walker was being discharged, Sarah's parents Thomas and Martha Miller suddenly appeared at the hospital. As I was pushing Henry's wheelchair to finish the paperwork, they came rushing over and fell to their knees in front of me. They sobbed and begged me to save Sarah Miller's life, even going so far as to press their foreheads to the hospital floor in desperation. My parents were absolutely stunned and quickly tried to help them up. Robert Walker asked Thomas Miller what on earth they were doing and why they had suddenly dropped to their knees. Martha Miller was crying so hard she could barely speak as she revealed that Sarah was suffering from acute, end-stage kidney failure. She said her daughter was running out of time. My father was speechless with shock at the news. He asked how such a thing could happen and immediately offered to help in any way possible. I felt a sharp pain in my temples as I realized exactly what was coming next. My father was the kind of person who would immediately forget all past grievances the moment an old friend was in trouble. Mr. Miller addressed my father and told him that the doctors had discovered that my tissue type was a perfect match for Sarah Miller. He asked if Robert Walker would convince me to donate one of my kidneys to save his daughter. My father was completely taken aback by the request. My father asked how such a match was even possible and wondered if tests had actually been performed. I let out a short, sarcastic laugh at the absurdity of it all. It was clear to me that she had sent her parents because she knew I was not going to volunteer my kidney this time around. She was desperate enough to use her parents to try and manipulate me. I told them quite casually that I had not actually gone for testing yet. However, I admitted that I was fully aware that my tissue type was indeed a perfect match for hers. I looked them in the eye with a slight smirk and informed them that I had absolutely no intention of ever donating a kidney to Sarah Miller. Thomas Miller immediately flew into a panic and accused me of being selfish. He shouted that I would only be losing a single kidney while his daughter was fighting for her very life. I gave him a cold look and asked him what his daughter's life had to do with me. I reminded him that I was not the one who had made her sick. Martha Miller grabbed my arm in desperation and told me she knew how much I loved Sarah. She promised that if I donated my kidney, she would make sure that Sarah married me. I let out a bitter laugh and asked if that marriage would also require me to buy her a house and a car, along with a massive $400,000 dowry. Mrs. Miller stammered that those things were standard for any marriage and argued that they would need the money for Sarah Miller's ongoing medical expenses anyway. My mother, Mary Walker, finally lost her temper and asked them if they were really demanding both my kidney and a fortune in property and cash. She asked them if they had any shame at all and declared that her son would never donate his kidney or marry a woman who was constantly ill. I felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude toward my mother in that moment. In my previous life, I had made the secret donation to Sarah Miller without ever telling a soul. When my parents finally found me in hospital back then, they just buried their looking back at my previous life. My parents were the ones I had failed the most. I had caused them an immeasurable amount of grief by being so reckless with my own health for someone who never truly cared about me. Thomas Miller still refused to back down and actually had the nerve to tell me that being a donor for Sarah was a privilege. He sneered that I'd spent my whole life following her around like a lost puppy anyway, and that everyone knew it. He claimed that I should consider it a distinct honor that his daughter would be walking around with a part of me inside her body. My father finally reached his limit and yelled at Thomas Miller to shut his mouth if he could not speak with even a shred of decency. He told him that he was absolutely disgusted to learn how he truly viewed me after all these years of friendship. I told my parents not to waste another second of their breath on those people and began pushing Henry toward the hospital exit. Martha Miller shrieked that we could not leave and lunged forward to grab my legs, screaming that I was obligated to save her daughter. I looked down at her with a cold, hard gaze and ordered her to let go of me immediately. I threatened to call the police right then and there if she did not remove her hands from my clothes. Once summer break came to an end, Emily Bennett and I began our junior year and started our first real internships. We managed to find positions at companies located right next to each other in San Francisco and decided to rent a small apartment together. About 5 months had passed when Sarah Miller managed to track me down once again. This time, she was actually kneeling right outside the main entrance of my office building on a busy street. The moment I walked out after my shift was over, a desperate light flickered in her eyes. I had not seen her in months, and the once glamorous Sarah Miller was now nothing but skin and bones with a sallow, sickly complexion. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, straw-like bun, and her lips were completely devoid of any color. She reached out toward me with trembling hands and begged me to save her life. She sobbed that she would never bother Emily or me again if I just helped her this one last time. She looked like a person who was truly at the end of her rope. I asked her why on earth she thought I would ever risk my own life to save hers after everything she had done. She shook her head frantically and claimed that if we were just more careful this time, I would not get sick or die like before. A bitter laugh escaped my lips until my eyes actually started to water from the sheer absurdity of her request. I told her to stop wasting her time because she knew deep down that I was never going to agree. I suggested that she start looking for a different donor if she truly wanted a chance at survival. By September of 2021, news reached me that the Millers had finally managed to find a suitable kidney donor for their daughter. They had been forced to mortgage their family home and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover the surgery and medical expenses. However, by the time the transplant finally happened, the damage to her body was already quite extensive. The new kidney managed to save her life for the time being, but her other organs were failing, and the doctors predicted she would not last many more years. Emily Bennett and I focused all of our energy on preparing for our graduate school entrance exams at the end of the year. In our free time, we would hold hands and go on trips to the beach or go hiking in the mountains to relieve our stress. We even visited a small chapel together to pray for our future and for the health of our families. When I finally clicked the button to check my results online, the number 389 flashed across the screen in bold letters. Emily called me a second later, screaming with joy that she had scored a 383 on her own exams. I told her my score, and we spent the next hour celebrating over the phone. During our graduate school commencement ceremony at NYU, I dropped to one knee and proposed to Emily Bennett in front of the entire graduating class. By the end of 2025, we were finally standing at the altar for our formal wedding ceremony. Sarah Miller made an unexpected appearance at our reception, looking like a completely different person. She gave us a small smile and handed me an envelope with a card inside. Her hair was cut very short, and she was dressed simply in a loose t-shirt and jeans, which was a far cry from her old style. As she turned to leave, I thought I heard her whisper that she would never find anyone else who would love her as much as I once did. I chose not to respond and simply watched her walk out of my life for the final time. I pulled my new wife close and told her that she was truly the greatest gift the universe had ever given me. Emily leaned into my ear and whispered that I was her greatest gift too, while wrapping her arms tightly around me in the middle of the dance floor. Real maturity is not just about learning how to love others, but about finally learning how to love yourself enough to set healthy boundaries. It is the wisdom of saving your heart for those who truly value it and never letting anyone cross the lines you have drawn for your own peace.